network shapes or topologies, if you want to get fancy, and their trade-offs in organizations. For the purposes of looking at governance and human organization, we split the network shapes into three different types: centralized, decentralized, and distributed. There are very few examples that I can think of, if any, of purely centralized networks. I'm not sure they exist. Certainly not at scale. The closest thing is probably military organizations. Maybe the North Korean government, but it's pretty rare to find wholly centralized networks. Historically, probably the closest thing would be European monarchy. Decentralized networks dominate the human organizational environment today, certainly from a government perspective. Modern corporations are a lot more centralized than government. If you look at any of the states in the G8, they can basically be described as bureaucracies competing for resources, with very little accountability, other than the competition for resources aspect. And they have in fact become so decentralized that the centralized voting mechanisms have become almost irrelevant for the functioning of the system. And most modern states are run by technocrats in leading these sort of hubs within decentralized networks. And then distributed networks, where there is effectively no centralization within the network. The only example I can really think of sort of a quote-unquote governance structure, that, or at least a human organization structure, would be a blockchain. And one of the features of these is that all the data that describes the network is stored at each node in the network, which I'll get to is a very high cost and slow way of doing things. And as you move back towards centralization, you gain efficiencies by not having to, basically you have a central post office of sorts, I guess, that coordinates the collection, storage, and flow of information through the network. And it's no accident that the early modern states, especially continental Europe, were built around post offices, Deutsche Post being the prime example of this. There's no, to me, or at least in these lectures, there's no ethical and moral valence to any of these. They solve different problems in different contexts, and there's costs and benefits to each of them. And I'm going to evaluate the costs and benefits of each approach using the ideas from collective action. So recall, taking effective collective action requires a strategy for coordination costs and solving the free rider problem. There's another set of ideas from Buchanan and Tullock, mid-20th century. They wrote this, at least in the social sciences, famous book called The Calculus of Consent. And they were trying to look at the trade-offs in different decision-making or voting systems. And they said, look, any decision-making system you have is going to have decision-making costs, which are very similar to coordination costs, or almost identical depending on which system you're looking at, and externalized costs. So these externalized costs are the costs that people who have votes or who have decision-making power within the system are imposing on others outside of the system. I think it's easiest to visualize this on a line running from dictatorship to unanimity in terms of decision making. So, unanimity, everyone in the community has to agree. If you've ever tried to make a decision in a group where unanimity is required, you know that it takes a long time. So, coordination or decision making costs are at their maximum for a group of people. But there's zero externalized costs. Presumably, if you come to a unanimous decision about something, everyone's happy. I mean, the nature of human psychology suggests to you that not everyone's going to be happy, but um, there are, at least they were party to the decision, and they can't really, and they had a veto. The important thing with unanimity is that every individual involved has a veto. So there can be really no legitimate claims to externalize costs. The far other end of the scale is dictatorship. So decision making costs are minimized. Uh, the dictator doesn't have to listen to anyone if they don't want to. They can make decisions very quickly, and but in this case, the externalized costs are maximized. Everyone but the dictator themselves potentially has costs that can be imposed on them by the decision maker. Most decision making mechanisms fall in between these two, and as you move towards the center of the line, you move towards a sort of a balance between these decision making and externalization costs. In sort of the classic democratic 50% hurdle in voting, there are going to be externalized costs, but it offers a balance against increasing coordination costs. So there's some compromise, but we've made the trade-off against externalization and the cost of compromise. It's really important in terms of deciding on your decision mechanism how timely the decision needs to be. If things are urgent, unanimity is not a good choice rule. So there's a reason that the surgeon is, well, actually, usually the anesthetist is the dictator in the operating room and calls the shots. If decisions have civilizational consequences but are not urgent, unanimity may be a good decision mechanism. So historically, you certainly see this in indigenous communities in the Americas, where they would have unanimous decision-making rules for large, like society-wide decisions.